The garden was Julian's sanctuary. A place of manicured silence in a life of orchestrated noise. Here, the only currency was sunlight and water, the only debts were the roses that needed pruning. He stood on the stone patio, the morning cool against the soles of his bare feet. The city below was a distant hum, a beast he had tamed and put on a leash made of fear and favor. He held a small pair of iron shears, the metal cold and solid in his hand. He snipped a dead leaf from a climbing ivy, the sound a tiny, satisfying crack in the quiet. This was his ritual. His peace. A place where no one dared to tread without invitation. Then, a sound. Not the city. Not the birds. A footstep on the gravel path. Hesitant. Frightened. He did not turn. His body remained perfectly still, a statue carved from decades of discipline. Only his eyes moved, shifting to the reflection in the dark glass of the patio door. It was Ilara. The housekeeper. An old woman, thin as a winter branch, her hands perpetually clasped before her as if in prayer or apology. She had come with the house, a relic from the previous owner, and had simply continued her duties in quiet, unobtrusive service. In the 10 years Julian had owned the estate, he had perhaps spoken a dozen words to her. She was standing at the edge of the lawn, a ghost in the morning mist, her face a mask of pure terror. This was a breach. A severe one. No one interrupted him in the garden. Ever. 2 of his men, Marco and Leo, materialized from the shadows of the colonnade. Their movements were fluid, silent predators sensing a disturbance in their territory. Marco took a step forward, his hand raised, ready to intercept, to remove the disruption. Julian lifted one finger. Just one. The men froze. It was a command more absolute than any shout. He turned slowly, his face unreadable. He looked at the old woman. Her eyes were wide, fixed on him, swimming with a fear so profound it seemed to steal the very air from her lungs. She was trembling, a leaf in a storm. "What is it?" His voice was low, calm, yet it carried the weight of thunder. She tried to speak, but only a choked gasp escaped. She pointed a trembling finger toward the far end of the garden, near the old oak tree that bordered the woods. "There," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "By the tree." Julian's gaze followed her finger. He saw nothing but the immaculate lawn, the shade of the ancient oak. He looked back at her. Her fear was not for him. It was something else. Something she had seen. "Show me," he said. It was not a request. She flinched but nodded, turning and walking with the stiff, shuffling gait of someone being led to their own execution. Julian followed. His men fell in behind him, their presence a silent, menacing shadow. The air grew thick with unspoken questions. The boss never moved for anyone. They walked past the rose bushes, past the stone fountain where water trickled with placid indifference. They reached the shade of the great oak. And there it was. The earth was disturbed. A neat rectangle of freshly turned soil, dark and rich against the perfect green of the lawn. It was the size of a man. The size of a grave. At its head, driven deep into the ground, was a small, simple headstone. Not marble, but plain, grey granite. It looked like it had been there for a century, weathered and worn, yet the soil around it was new. Julian's eyes narrowed. He stepped closer, his bare feet sinking slightly into the soft dirt. He read the words carved into the stone. The carving was fresh. Crisp. Ilara Vance. And below the name, a single date. Yesterday's date. He felt a coldness spread through him that had nothing to do with the morning air. A silence fell over the garden, so deep and absolute it felt like the world had stopped turning. He heard the old woman let out a small, broken sob behind him. He turned his head slowly, his eyes locking onto hers. Her name. Her own name, carved on a tombstone in his garden. Marco stepped forward, his face pale. "Boss, this is a message." Julian didn't look at him. His gaze was fixed on the terrified old woman. He saw the name on the stone, and he saw her, and for the first time in 20 years, the walls inside his mind cracked. A memory, buried under decades of blood and iron, pushed its way to the surface. Ilara. He raised a hand, not to his men this time, but as if to ward off a ghost. The calm he had cultivated for a lifetime shattered into a million pieces. The garden was no longer a sanctuary. It was a tomb. And someone had just desecrated it. Stay with me until the end, because what happens next will change everything you think you know about justice and redemption. If you're enjoying this story, do me a favor and hit that like button. Make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next. And comment below to let me know where in the world you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, let's get back to it. Julian was not a man given to surprise. His world operated on a predictable axis of power, loyalty, and violence. He anticipated moves 3 steps ahead, saw betrayals before they were conceived, and understood the nuances of human greed with the weary expertise of a master craftsman. But this was different. This was not business. This was sacrilege. The name Ilara was not just a name. It was a key. A key to a room in his heart he had bricked up and forgotten existed. A room filled with the ghost of a girl with wildflower hair and a smile that could disarm armies. The first Ilara. His Ilara. Lost to a fever in a world before he had the power to stop death itself. He had been a boy then. Powerless. Poor. He had watched her fade, and in her passing, a part of him had turned to stone. The man he became, the feared and untouchable Julian, was built on the foundations of that boy's failure. He had sworn that day he would never be powerless again. He would control everything, so that he would never have to lose anything he cared about ever again. For decades, no one had spoken that name in his presence. It was an unspoken rule, a piece of forgotten history known only to a very few old-timers, most of whom were now long gone. To see it carved on a headstone, in his own garden, attached to this trembling, innocent old woman, it was a violation of the deepest order. Someone had dug up his soul and put it on display. He looked at the housekeeper, Ilara Vance. She was nothing like the girl he had lost. This woman was old, her face a roadmap of a long, hard life. She was stout and frail, her hands gnarled from a lifetime of work. She had worked in this house for over 30 years, first for the oil baron who built it, and then for him. She was part of the furniture, a silent presence who cleaned away the evidence of his life and asked for nothing in return. She polished the tables where he made deals that toppled corporations. She swept the floors where men had knelt and begged for their lives. She was the definition of an innocent. A civilian. And the rules, his rules, were absolute. Civilians were not to be touched. Ever. To harm an innocent was not just a mistake, it was a sign of weakness. It was a sloppy, dishonorable act performed by thugs and fools, not by men of power. It was the kind of thing he punished with extreme prejudice. But to harm this specific innocent, to use her as a pawn in a game and, in doing so, to use that sacred name, that was not just an act of aggression. It was a declaration of war on Julian himself. Not his business. Not his territory. Him. His past. His heart. He saw the way Marco and Leo were looking at him. They saw the crack in his armor. They had never seen him like this. His usual cold, calculating demeanor was gone, replaced by a stillness that was far more terrifying. It was the stillness of a storm gathering its strength just before it breaks. Marco, Julian said, his voice dangerously quiet. Boss. Take her inside. Put her in the East guest suite. Post a man on her door. Nothing and no one gets near her. Is that understood? Yes, boss. She is not to be frightened. She is to be treated as my guest. Get her anything she needs. Tea. Food. Whatever she wants. Marco nodded, his expression grim. He understood the gravity of the command. He gently touched the old woman's arm. Come with me, miss. You'll be safe. Ilara looked from Marco's face to Julian's, her eyes filled with confusion and terror. She was a mouse caught between two lions, unsure which one would devour her. Julian met her gaze. He softened his expression, a feat that took a conscious, physical effort. "You will not be harmed," he said, his voice losing its hard edge for just a moment. "I give you my word." In his world, that was a vow sealed in blood. She seemed to understand. A small measure of the terror receded from her eyes, replaced by a sliver of trust. She allowed Marco to lead her away, her small frame looking impossibly fragile next to the big man's bulk. Julian remained by the empty grave, Leo standing a respectful distance away. He stared at the name on the stone. Ilara Vance. He had never even known her last name until this moment. For 10 years, she had simply been Ilara, the housekeeper. A name he heard spoken by other staff, a name that always caused a faint, almost imperceptible echo in his memory. He had never made the connection, had never allowed himself to. Now, the connection was a screaming siren in his head. This was an inside job. It had to be. To know about the garden, to get a stonemason and a digging crew onto the grounds without being detected, and most of all, to know the significance of that name, even if they didn't understand the full depth of it, required intimate knowledge of his life. His organization was a family, bound by loyalty and fear. A betrayal of this magnitude was unthinkable. It meant a rot had set in. A deep, cancerous rot. And he knew, with a certainty that settled like ice in his gut, who it was. There was only one person with the ambition, the arrogance, and the recklessness to try something like this. Only one person who saw the old ways, his rules about honor and civilians, as a weakness to be exploited. Silvio. His nephew. His own sister's son. A young, hungry capo he had been grooming to one day take on more responsibility. Silvio was smart, ruthless, but he lacked the one thing Julian valued above all else, respect. He saw the world as a thing to be conquered, not managed. He saw Julian's code of honor not as a strength, but as a quaint, outdated sentimentality. Silvio must have heard the whispers of the name Ilara from some old-timer. He wouldn't know the story, the full weight of it. He would just see it as a vulnerability, a chink in the old man's armor. He thought he was being clever, sending a subtle threat. A psychological game. He had no idea what he had truly done. He had not sent a message. He had signed his own death warrant. Julian's mind, once clouded by the ghost of a memory, was now crystal clear. The grief and shock receded, replaced by a cold, surgical rage. The emotional turmoil of the past few minutes coalesced into a single point of purpose. Protect the innocent. Punish the guilty. He turned to Leo. Get the car. We're going for a drive. Where to, boss? Julian looked from the empty grave to the sprawling city below. To visit my nephew, he said, and his voice was the sound of winter. It's time for a family meeting. The decision was not a decision at all. It was an inevitability. From the moment he saw the name on that stone, there was only one path forward. All the rules of his business, all the logic of profit and loss, of risk and reward, they all dissolved in the face of this singular, profound disrespect. His code was not a set of guidelines for his criminal enterprise, it was the very architecture of his soul. It was what separated him from the animals, the common thugs who preyed on the weak. It was what allowed him to look in the mirror each morning. And the first, most sacred rule of that code was the protection of the innocent. The second was that loyalty was absolute. Silvio had violated both. He had targeted a harmless old woman, a civilian in the purest sense, and in doing so, had shown a profound disloyalty not just to Julian as his boss, but to Julian as his family. As he walked back toward the house, the cold rage inside him began to burn hot. He thought of the first Ilara. Her laughter. The way she would steal flowers from the gardens of the rich to press between the pages of a book. The promise he had made to her as she lay dying, that he would build a world so powerful that nothing bad would ever happen to anyone he loved again. A bitter, hollow promise. He had built the power, yes. He had built an empire. But he had walled himself off from loving anyone, so the promise had become meaningless. A monument to a failure he could never outrun. And now, this. A chance. A strange, twisted, unexpected chance to keep a version of that promise. Protecting this Ilara, this stranger who shared a name with a ghost, became a proxy war against his own past. It was a chance to finally, after 50 years, do what he could not do for the girl he loved. It was irrational. It was sentimental. It was bad for business. And he did not care. He entered his study, a cavernous room of dark wood and leather. Marco was waiting for him. "She's in the suite," Marco reported. "Shaken, but she's drinking some tea." "The man is on the door." "Good," Julian said, his voice clipped. He went to his desk, a massive block of mahogany that had seen more history than most museums. He ran a hand over its smooth, cool surface. "Marco." "Boss." "Who was on the grounds crew this morning?" "The usual team from Vercelli Landscaping. They've done the grounds for 5 years." "Solid." "And the stonemason?" "A headstone doesn't just appear. I'm already looking into it. There are only a few in the city who do that kind of custom work on short notice. Quiet work. I'll have a name within the hour." Julian nodded. "It won't be necessary." Marco looked at him, confused. "Boss?" "I know who it was." A heavy silence filled the room. Marco's expression hardened. He was fiercely loyal, a man who had been with Julian since they were young. He understood his boss better than anyone. He saw the look in Julian's eyes and knew this was not just another rival making a move. "Silvio," Marco said, the name tasting like poison. Julian just nodded, his jaw tight. "He wouldn't," Marco breathed, but even as he said it, he knew it was a lie. He knew Silvio's ambition. He had warned Julian about it. To use an old woman, to use that name. It's unthinkable. "He thinks it's clever," Julian said, his voice laced with contempt. "He thinks he's showing me he's not afraid. He thinks he's sending a message about the future. That my time is over." Julian walked to the window and looked out at the garden. The grounds crew was already there, filling in the hole, removing the headstone with the care of a bomb disposal unit. Erasing the wound. But the scar was already there, on the land, and in his mind. "He's forgotten our history," Julian murmured, more to himself than to Marco. "He's forgotten what we are, and why we have these rules. He sees honor as a price, not a principle." He turned back to Marco, his eyes blazing with a cold fire. The time for reflection was over. The time for action had come. "Tonight," Julian began, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "Silvio is hosting a dinner at his restaurant. The Florentine. For his inner circle. To celebrate his ambition. We could take him on the street," Marco suggested. "Clean. Quiet." "No," Julian said firmly. "This will not be quiet. This is not a hit. This is a lesson. A lesson for anyone else who thinks my rules are suggestions." He began to pace, the predator inside him fully awakened. The mobilization was happening not with a flurry of phone calls, but with a few precise commands. "Get Leo and Enzo. No one else. Just the 3 of you. We will walk into his dinner. We will be his guests." Marco's eyes widened slightly. This was a massive breach of protocol. To walk into another capo's territory, his own restaurant, unannounced, it was an open challenge. It would mean war. "Boss, if we do that." "There will be no war," Julian cut him off. "There will only be a correction. A realignment." He stopped pacing and looked directly at Marco. "Silvio did this to prove a point. That I am old and soft. I will go there tonight to prove him wrong. I will do it in front of his own men, so they understand the price of disloyalty. So they understand what happens when you cross a line that should never be crossed. The plan was forming, not as a complex strategy, but as a simple, brutal act of will. "We will not be armed," Julian added. Now Marco was truly shocked. "Boss, that's suicide." "They will be. At least a dozen of his men." "We will not need guns," Julian said, his voice utterly certain. "We will be armed with something far more powerful. We will be armed with the truth of what he has done. I will tell his men what he did. I will tell them he targeted a defenseless old woman. An innocent. I will tell them that he did it to dishonor his own family. And then I will ask them if that is the kind of man they want to follow into the future." He was not just planning to eliminate a threat. He was planning to dismantle Silvio's entire power base from the inside out, using his own code of honor as the weapon. "And what about Silvio?" Marco asked quietly. Julian's face became a mask of stone. "Silvio is mine." The plan was brutal in its simplicity. It was not about stealth or surprise. It was about presence and authority. Julian understood that true power was not the ability to pull a trigger. It was the ability to make other men not want to pull theirs. He would walk into the lion's den and remind the cubs who was king. The car ride into the city was silent. Leo drove, his eyes fixed on the road, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Marco sat in the passenger seat, his body tense. Julian sat in the back, perfectly still, watching the city lights streak by. He was not thinking about the violence to come. He was thinking about a girl picking wildflowers in a field 50 years ago. He was thinking about a promise. They pulled up across the street from the Florentine. It was Silvio's place, gaudy and new, with bright neon lights that screamed for attention. It lacked the quiet, old-world elegance of Julian's own establishments. It was a place for new money, for loud voices and flashy suits. It was Silvio's personality made manifest in brick and mortar. Through the large front window, they could see the main dining room. Silvio was at a large table in the center, surrounded by his top men. They were laughing, drinking, toasting, celebrating a victory they had not yet earned. 10 of them at the table, Marco observed, his voice low. At least 4 more guards. 2 at the door, 2 by the kitchen. "It doesn't matter," Julian said. "They are his men. They follow his rules. But tonight, they will be reminded of mine." "Ready, boss?" Leo asked, his voice tight. Julian didn't answer. He simply opened his door and got out. He straightened his jacket, a simple, dark suit that was perfectly tailored. He looked like a chairman of the board, not a crime lord. Marco and Leo flanked him, their large frames a silent testament to the power they represented. They crossed the street, the traffic seeming to slow for them. The 2 guards at the door saw them coming. Their eyes widened in panic. They looked at each other, unsure of what to do. Julian was a legend, a figure from another era. To see him here, at their door, was like seeing a ghost walk out of a history book. One of the guards, a young kid with more muscle than sense, put a hand on the door to block it. "This is a private party," he stammered. Julian didn't break his stride. He didn't even look at the guard. He simply continued walking forward. Marco stepped in front of the guard, not touching him, but his sheer presence was enough to make the young man stumble back as if he'd been hit. They walked into the restaurant. The laughter and conversation at the central table died instantly. A wave of silence washed over the room. Every eye turned to the door. To Julian. Silvio, a glass of wine halfway to his lips, froze. The color drained from his face. He saw his uncle standing there, flanked by his 2 most loyal men, and the celebratory mood curdled into pure dread. He had expected a phone call. A quiet summons. A tense meeting in a warehouse. Not this. Never this. This was a public execution. Julian walked slowly, deliberately, toward the table. His footsteps were the only sound in the dead-silent room. The other patrons, the civilians, looked on in confused fear, sensing they were witnessing something far outside their understanding. He stopped at the head of Silvio's table. He looked down at his nephew, his eyes cold and empty. "Uncle," Silvio said, his voice strained. He tried to force a smile. "What a surprise. I didn't know you were coming. We would have set a place." "I'm not here to eat, Silvio," Julian said, his voice calm but carrying to every corner of the room. "I'm here to talk about a piece of property. A garden." Silvio's false smile vanished. He knew. "I don't know what you're talking about," he blustered, looking to his men for support. But their eyes were darting between him and Julian, their loyalty suddenly a commodity up for auction. "You dug a grave in my garden," Julian stated, his voice flat. "And you put a name on it. The name of my housekeeper. A woman who has worked for my family for 30 years. An old woman. An innocent." A murmur went through Silvio's men. They looked at their boss, their expression shifting from bravado to confusion and disgust. This was not how they operated. This was not honorable. "She's just some old lady," Silvio spat, his fear turning to desperate anger. It was a message. A business move. To show you that your sentimentality is a weakness. A weakness? Julian's voice rose, just slightly, but it was enough to make everyone in the room flinch. "You think honor is a weakness? You think protecting those who cannot protect themselves is a weakness? Our entire world, the world that gives you the money to buy this gaudy restaurant and these cheap suits, is built on that honor. It is the only thing that separates us from the animals in the street." He leaned forward, placing his hands on the table. He looked at each of Silvio's men, one by one. "He did this," Julian said, pointing a finger at Silvio. "He threatened a harmless old woman. He did it to disrespect me. To disrespect our family. To disrespect the code that has kept us strong for 50 years. Is this the man you want to follow? A man who finds his courage by terrorizing the elderly? A man who has no honor?" No one spoke. The men looked at the floor, at their plates, anywhere but at Silvio. The foundation of Silvio's power had crumbled in less than a minute. Silvio saw it. He saw the doubt and contempt in his own men's eyes. He was losing them. In a fit of panicked rage, he stood up, knocking his chair over. His hand went to the small of his back, reaching for the gun tucked there. "You're finished, old man," he screamed. "Your time is over." Marco and Leo tensed, ready to move. But Julian was faster. Not with his hands. With his words. "Her name was Ilara," Julian said, his voice suddenly soft, filled with a pain that was 50 years old. "She was the first person I ever loved. And I lost her. The name you desecrated was not just a name. It was a memory. The only good thing I had from a life before all of this." He looked directly at Silvio, and for the first time, his eyes showed not rage, but a profound, bottomless sorrow. "You didn't just dig a grave for a housekeeper, you fool. You danced on mine." Silvio froze, his hand on his gun. The story, the raw, unexpected confession, hung in the air. It was a truth so powerful it sucked all the violence out of the room. His men stared at him now with open revulsion. He had not just broken a rule of business. He had violated something sacred. The moment was broken. Silvio's authority was gone, evaporated. He was just a boy who had made a terrible, terrible mistake. Julian straightened up. The sorrow in his eyes was replaced once more by ice. "Get out," he said to Silvio's men. "All of you. Leave. This family is under new management." They didn't hesitate. They stood up, one by one, and walked out of the restaurant without a single backward glance at the man they had followed just minutes before. They left him alone, standing there, exposed and powerless. Now, it was just Julian, Marco, Leo, and Silvio. Silvio finally pulled the gun, his hand trembling. He pointed it at Julian. I'll still kill you, he hissed, his voice cracking. Julian looked at the gun, then at his nephew's terrified face. He felt nothing but a great, weary pity. No, Julian said quietly. You won't. He turned his back on Silvio and began to walk toward the door. It was the ultimate display of contempt. The ultimate statement of power. Silvio screamed in frustration and rage. He could have fired. He should have fired. But he couldn't. The weight of his dishonor was too heavy. As Julian reached the door, he paused. He looked at Marco. Close the restaurant, he said. Permanently. Marco nodded grimly. He understood the command. Silvio would not be bothering anyone ever again. The problem was resolved. Julian found Elara in the East Guest Suite. It was a room larger than her entire house, filled with plush furniture and priceless art. She was sitting in a large armchair by the window, a teacup untouched on the table beside her. She looked small and lost in the opulence of the room. She looked up as he entered, her eyes wide with fear. The guard at the door had been dismissed. They were alone. It's over, Julian said gently. You are safe. She stared at him, trying to process the words. The man who did it. He will not trouble you again, Julian confirmed. The finality in his tone left no room for doubt. A wave of relief washed over her, so potent it seemed to make her sag in the chair. The terror that had been her constant companion for the past day finally began to recede. Tears welled in her eyes, not of fear, but of gratitude. Thank you, she whispered, her voice trembling. I don't have anything to pay you. I have some savings. She started to rise, as if to go and find her meager life's earnings. No, Julian said, raising a hand. Please. Sit. She sank back into the chair. He walked further into the room, his presence filling the space. He stopped a few feet from her, an awkward distance between them. He, a man who commanded legions, felt strangely out of his depth in the presence of this simple, good woman. You have already paid me, he said, his voice quiet. She looked at him, confused. How? He hesitated, the words catching in his throat. It was a vulnerability he had not felt in half a century. Your name, he began, struggling to explain something he barely understood himself. It reminded me of something. Someone. It reminded me of a promise I made a long time ago. A promise to protect the good things in the world. He looked away from her, toward the window. I have not done a very good job of that. Tonight, you gave me a chance to keep that promise. That is a payment worth more than all the money in this city. Elara listened, her expression shifting from gratitude to a deep, profound understanding. She did not know the details, but she understood the heart of it. She saw the pain in this powerful, dangerous man. She saw the ghost he was wrestling with. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked the question that had been hovering in the air between them. Are you a bad man, Mr. Julian? The question was simple, direct, and utterly disarming. It was a child's question, but it held the weight of a final judgment. He had been called many things in his life, monster, killer, king, but no one had ever simply asked him if he was bad. He turned back to face her. He considered the question. He thought of the things he had done. The lives he had taken. The empire he had built on fear. And he thought of what he had done tonight. The line he had drawn in the sand. I am what I have to be to survive in the world I live in, he answered, his voice heavy with the truth of it. Most days, that requires me to be a man you would not want to know. He took a step closer, his eyes meeting hers. But tonight, he said, and a flicker of something long dormant, a hint of a smile, perhaps, touched his lips. Tonight, because of you, I got to be a good man. The honesty of his answer was more powerful than any lie or justification he could have offered. It was a confession and a declaration all at once. Elara nodded slowly, a single tear tracing a path down her wrinkled cheek. She believed him. You will not be returning to your old duties, he continued, his tone shifting back to one of quiet command. You have worked long enough. I have purchased a small house for you. A cottage by the lake, north of the city. It has a garden. It is yours. You will want for nothing for the rest of your days. This is not a request. It is a fact. She was stunned into silence. A house. A life of peace. It was a dream she had never even dared to have. But why, she stammered. Because honor demands it, he said simply. And because it is what I should have done a long time ago. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a simple, thick business card. It was blank except for a single phone number embossed in gold. This is my private number, he said, placing it on the table next to her. If anyone ever troubles you again, for any reason, if a storm damages your roof, if you feel lonely, if you need anything at all, you call this number. It will be answered, day or night. He was not just giving her a house. He was giving her his permanent, unwavering protection. He was placing her under the shield of his power, making her untouchable. He turned to leave. He had said all he needed to say. The transaction was complete. Mr. Julian, she called out, her voice stronger now. He paused at the door and looked back. The girl, she said softly. The other Ilara. I think she would be very proud of the man you were tonight. Julian's composure finally broke. He could not speak. He simply gave a short, sharp nod, a gesture of acknowledgement that carried the weight of a lifetime of unspoken grief and gratitude. Then he turned and walked out, closing the door softly behind him, leaving the old woman to her new life, and returning to his own. 3 years passed. The city remained Julian's. His power, far from being diminished by the incident with Silvio, was more absolute than ever. The story of that night at the Florentine had become a legend whispered in the underworld, a brutal lesson on the importance of the old ways. The code of honor was reinforced not with memos, but with the ghost of a closed restaurant and a missing nephew. Julian sat in his study. The room was the same. The dark wood, the leather chairs, the view of the sprawling city. But something was different. On the corner of his massive mahogany desk, next to the silver-framed photograph of his long-deceased wife, sat a small, simple glass paperweight. Inside it, perfectly preserved, was a single, pressed wildflower. A daisy. It had arrived by mail a week after Ilara Vance had moved into her cottage. There was no note. Just the flower. He had known instantly who it was from. It was a nod to a story she could not have known, a connection across time to the other Ilara, the girl who loved to press flowers in books. It was a thank you, and a symbol of a shared, unspoken understanding. It had become his most prized possession. He would sometimes receive calls on the private number. Not often. Once, Ilara called to tell him a family of ducks had nested in her garden. Another time, to ask him if he liked lemon cake, because she had baked too much. They were small, simple intrusions of light into his world of shadows. Each call was a reminder of the night he chose to be a good man. He had visited her once, unannounced. He had found her on her knees in her garden, tending to her roses, her face peaceful and content. She had not seemed surprised to see him. They had shared a cup of tea on her small porch, speaking very little, simply watching the sun set over the lake. It was the most peace he had felt since he was a boy. His world was still one of violence and fear. He was still the man he had to be. But something had shifted inside him. The bricked-up room in his heart now had a small window, and sometimes, a little bit of light got in. The memory of the first Ilara was no longer just a source of pain, it was now tied to an act of redemption. For in the end, true strength is not measured by the fear one can inspire, but by the protection one can offer. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act in the face of it, to defend those who cannot defend themselves. In a world full of darkness, a single act of kindness can be its own form of salvation, a promise kept not to the dead, but to the living, and to the faint, hopeful echo of the person you were always meant to be.